I should have known something was wrong when Marcus hesitated at the coffee shop that Tuesday morning. We'd been together for 2 years, and I'd learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the way his eyes would dart away when he was uncomfortable, how his fingers would tap against his coffee cup when he was calculating his next words. But that morning, I was too caught up in my own excitement about finally meeting more of his family to notice the warning signs. The coffee shop was one of those places that tries too hard to be cozy. Exposed brick walls, mismatched furniture, the kind of indie music that makes you feel like you're discovering something secret. We'd been coming here every Tuesday for months, a ritual that had started accidentally when we both happened to be running late for work on the same day. Now it felt like sacred ground, this small table by the window where we'd planned weekend trips and shared work, gossip, and slowly, carefully, built the architecture of our relationship. "So, tell me about this dinner," I said, stirring honey into my latte. The barista had drawn a heart in the foam, and I found myself studying it as if it might contain some hidden message about my future. "Should I bring anything? Flowers for your mom? Wine?" Marcus shifted in his seat, that familiar tap, 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 starting against his ceramic mug. He was wearing the blue button-down I'd bought him for his birthday, the one that made his eyes look impossibly deep. I'd spent 20 minutes that morning choosing my outfit, wanting to look perfect for him, for us, for the future I was so certain we were building together. "It's really nothing fancy, Sarah. Just a casual family dinner. My mom's making her famous lasagna, and a few relatives will be there. Nothing you need to stress about." The word stress hung in the air between us like a question mark. Why would I stress about meeting his family? We'd been talking about it for months. I'd been the one pushing for it, actually, wondering when I'd finally get to see where he came from, to understand the stories he'd tell about his childhood, to put faces to the names he'd mention in passing. I'd spent hours imagining that dinner. I'd pictured his mother's kitchen, warm and cluttered with the kind of lived-in comfort that comes from decades of family meals. I'd imagined his father asking me about my work, genuinely interested in my thoughts about marketing strategies and consumer behavior. I'd pictured Rebecca, his sister, the one he described as his best friend, pulling me aside to show me embarrassing photos of Marcus as a child. I'd been preparing for this dinner in ways I hadn't even admitted to myself. I'd been practicing stories that would make them laugh, researching topics that might interest his father, planning compliments for his mother's cooking. I'd been trying to become the kind of person who would fit seamlessly into their world, who would make Marcus proud to call me his girlfriend. "I'm excited," I said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. His skin felt cold despite the warm coffee cup he'd been holding. "I've been wanting to meet Rebecca for so long. You always talk about how close you two are." Something flickered across his face. So quickly I almost missed it. Later I would replay this moment over and over, wondering how I'd missed such an obvious tell. But in that moment, I was too focused on the future to notice the shadows in his expression. Right, Rebecca. She'll be there. He glanced at his watch, a vintage piece his grandfather had given him. I'd always loved the way he wore it, slightly loose on his wrist, a tangible connection to the family history I was so eager to become part of. I should get going. Meeting starts in 20 minutes. I watched him gather his things, noting how he avoided my eyes. His movements seemed rushed, almost frantic, like he was fleeing something. But I told myself it was just work stress. Marcus had always been driven, ambitious in a way that both attracted and intimidated me. He worked at a consulting firm downtown, the kind of place where meetings started at 7 in the morning and ended well after dark. I'd learned to read his moods based on the demands of his job, to understand when he needed space and when he needed comfort. "Marcus? Everything okay?" He leaned down to kiss my forehead. a gesture that had always felt tender but now seemed somehow dismissive, like he was patting a child on the head before leaving for important adult business. "Of course. Just work stuff on my mind. I'll call you later about the details." But the details never came. Not really. When I texted him that afternoon asking what time to be ready, he responded with a simple 7 p.m. When I asked what I should wear, he said, "Whatever you're comfortable in." When I suggested we bring dessert, he said, "My mom has it covered." Each response felt like a door closing, but I told myself I was overthinking it. Marcus had always been a minimalist when it came to communication. It was part of his charm, the way he could say more with a look than most people could with a paragraph. I'd learned to read between the lines, to appreciate the economy of his words. I spent the rest of that week in a state of nervous anticipation. I bought a new dress, navy blue with a subtle pattern that I hoped struck the right balance between sophisticated and approachable. I researched conversation topics, reading up on current events and local politics, anything that might help me connect with his family. I practiced introductions in the mirror, trying to find the right tone between confidence and humility. My friends were amused by my preparation. "It's just dinner," my coworker Lisa said when I showed her the dress. "You're acting like you're meeting the Queen of England." But it felt that important to me. I'd been essentially alone in the world since my parents died in a car accident when I was 22. I'd had boyfriends since then, of course, but none of them had ever felt like family potential. None of them had ever made me picture Sunday dinners and holiday traditions and the kind of belonging that goes beyond romantic love. Marcus was different. From our first date, when he'd taken me to a tiny Ethiopian restaurant and spent 2 hours explaining the cultural significance of the coffee ceremony, I'd sensed that he came from something solid, something rooted. He talked about his family with the kind of easy affection that spoke to deep bonds and shared history. He mentioned inside jokes and family traditions, annual camping trips and birthday celebrations that involved multiple generations. I'd grown up in a small nuclear family, just me and my parents, who'd been older when they had me, and somewhat reserved in their expressions of love. They'd been good parents, supportive and present, but we'd never been the kind of family that gathered for raucous celebrations or created elaborate traditions. Our love had been quiet, steady, assumed rather than declared. Marcus's family sounded like something from a movie. Loud and chaotic, and full of the kind of warmth that spills over into laughter and teasing and long conversations that stretch into the night. I'd been hungry for that kind of belonging my entire life, though I'd never admitted it to myself until I met Marcus. Friday evening arrived with the kind of October chill that makes you want to curl up with someone you love. I spent an hour getting ready, changing outfits 3 times before settling on the navy dress I'd bought specifically for this occasion. I paired it with low heels and simple jewelry, wanting to look put together without appearing to be trying too hard. I studied myself in the mirror, trying to see what Marcus's family would see. I'd always been told I was pretty, but in a conventional way that never felt particularly special. Brown hair, brown eyes, average height. The kind of face that was pleasant but forgettable. I'd learned to rely on my personality to make impressions, to be the kind of person who was remembered for being funny or kind or interesting, rather than beautiful. Looking at myself that night, I felt the familiar pang of insecurity that had plagued me since childhood. Was I smart enough for Marcus's family? Accomplished enough? Interesting enough? Would they see what he saw in me? Or would they wonder what he was doing with someone so ordinary? I pushed the thoughts away and focused on the evening ahead. I was about to meet the people who had shaped the man I loved, about to step into the world that had made him who he was. It felt like the beginning of something important, a threshold I was crossing into a deeper level of commitment and intimacy. Marcus picked me up at 6:30, looking handsome in dark jeans and a button-down shirt. He seemed nervous, checking his phone repeatedly during the drive across town. The radio was playing softly, some indie folk song that I'd normally find soothing. But tonight the lyrics seemed to emphasize the space between us rather than bridge it. "You sure you're okay?" I asked as we sat in traffic on the interstate. "Just want everything to go smoothly," he said, but his knuckles were white against the steering wheel. I reached over to touch his arm, trying to offer comfort. They're going to love me. And even if they don't, it doesn't matter. What matters is that we love each other. The words felt true as I said them, but I noticed he didn't respond. He just nodded slightly and changed lanes, his focus entirely on the road ahead. The restaurant he pulled up to was nothing like what I'd expected. Instead of the cozy family home I'd imagined, with warm light spilling from kitchen windows and the sound of laughter drifting into the night, we were standing in front of Romano's, a mid-tier Italian chain restaurant with harsh fluorescent lighting and laminated menus. "I thought we were going to your mom's house," I said, confused. "Change of plans," Marcus said quickly, his voice tight. "She wasn't feeling up to cooking after all. Last-minute thing." I felt a flicker of disappointment, but pushed it aside. Of course, plans changed sometimes. Maybe his mother had come down with something, or maybe there had been a family emergency. These things happened. The important thing was that I was finally going to meet them, to start building the relationships that would hopefully last for decades. Inside the restaurant was exactly what I'd expected from the exterior. Generic and uninspiring, with the kind of aggressively cheerful decor that tries to compensate for lack of personality. The hostess led us to a round table in the back corner, where 5 people were already seated. I met his parents first, Robert and Linda, a distinguished-looking couple in their early 60s. Robert was tall and silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that suggested success in business. Linda was petite and carefully put together, wearing a silk blouse and pearl earrings that spoke to both taste and means. They were pleasant enough, shaking my hand and making the appropriate welcoming noises. But something in their manner felt performative, like they were reading from a script they'd memorized but didn't particularly believe in. "So nice to finally meet you, Sarah," Linda said, her smile bright but somehow hollow. "Marcus has told us so much about you." Had he? I wondered what exactly he'd shared, what version of me they'd been presented with. I tried to read their faces for clues, but they were both masters of polite neutrality, giving nothing away. Uncle Tom and Aunt Susan were next, a chatty couple who seemed genuinely warm but also slightly uncomfortable, like they weren't quite sure why they were there. They asked me about my job at the marketing firm, commenting on the weather, making the kind of polite conversation that fills space without creating connection. "Marketing, how interesting," Susan said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. "Must be very creative." I launched into a brief explanation of what I did, trying to make it sound more interesting than it probably was. I talked about consumer psychology and brand strategy, about the challenge of creating authentic connections in an increasingly skeptical marketplace. But I could see their eyes glazing over, their polite smiles becoming more strained with each word. Then there was Rebecca, Marcus's younger sister, and she was nothing like I'd imagined. Based on his stories, I'd expected someone vibrant and outspoken, the kind of person who would immediately pull me into her orbit with questions and observations and unsolicited advice. Instead, she was quiet, almost withdrawn, barely meeting my eyes during our brief introduction. She was beautiful in a way that made me suddenly conscious of my own ordinariness. Tall and blonde with the kind of effortless style that comes from good genes and expensive clothes. She looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. But more than that, she looked like she belonged in a way that I was beginning to realize I never would. "So nice to finally meet you," she said, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. There was something guarded about her, like she was holding herself back from saying what she really thought. Throughout dinner, I felt like I was watching a performance. Everyone was playing their parts: the loving parents, the protective uncle, the sweet sister. But it all felt rehearsed, like they were following a script they'd memorized but didn't quite believe in. The conversation never moved beyond surface-level pleasantries, and every topic I tried to introduce seemed to die a quick death. I asked about family traditions, hoping to hear the kind of stories Marcus had shared with me, but they were vague, deflective, offering generic responses about spending time together without any of the specific details that would have made the stories come alive. I asked about Rebecca's work, knowing from Marcus that she was some kind of event planner. But she was evasive, mentioning that she was between projects, without elaborating. When I pressed gently, asking about what kinds of events she enjoyed planning most, she changed the subject entirely. I asked about their neighborhood, their hobbies, their opinions on local restaurants. But every question felt like it was hitting a wall, bouncing back without creating any real connection or understanding. Marcus kept checking his phone, muttering apologies about work emails. But I noticed he wasn't actually reading anything. He was just staring at the screen, using it as an excuse to avoid participating in the conversation. Rebecca excused herself twice to take phone calls, and both times she was gone for longer than seemed necessary. The food was mediocre at best, the kind of uninspired Italian-American fare that tastes like it came from a corporate test kitchen. The lasagna was watery, the salad wilted, the bread stale. I found myself thinking about all the home-cooked meals Marcus had described, his mother's legendary cooking skills, the recipes that had been passed down through generations. This wasn't the family dinner he'd promised me. This was something else entirely, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what. By the time we shared a generic tiramisu for dessert, I was counting the minutes until we could leave. The conversation had devolved into awkward silences, punctuated by forced observations about the weather and the restaurant's decor. I felt like I was failing some kind of test, though I couldn't understand what I was being tested on or what the criteria for success might be. "That was nice," I said as we walked back to the car, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. "Yeah," Marcus agreed, but he sounded relieved rather than satisfied. "They liked you," he added, but his tone lacked conviction. Did they? I wondered, because it hadn't felt like they'd liked me. It had felt like they were tolerating me, going through the motions of politeness while withholding any real warmth or acceptance. The drive home was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I stared out the window at the passing streetlights, trying to understand what had gone wrong. Had I been too eager? Too quiet? Too talkative? Had I asked the wrong questions, worn the wrong outfit, said something that offended them without realizing it? "They seemed nice," I said finally, though the words felt hollow. "Yeah, they are," Marcus replied, but he was focused on the road, not on me. "Your sister is beautiful." "She is," he agreed. "She's going through a tough time right now. Work stuff." I wanted to ask more, to understand what kind of tough time, but something in his tone suggested the topic was closed. I filed the information away, adding it to the growing list of things about Marcus's family that didn't quite make sense. In the weeks that followed, I replayed that evening over and over, trying to understand what had felt so wrong about it. I'd wanted to bring it up with Marcus, to ask him about the disconnect between his stories and the reality of meeting his family. But every time I started to broach the subject, he'd change the topic or distract me with something else. "How do you think dinner went?" I asked one evening as we were cooking together in my apartment. "Fine," he said, focusing intently on chopping vegetables. They thought you were great. Did they? Because it felt a little formal, like they were being polite rather than genuinely welcoming. That's just how they are, he said quickly. They're not big on emotional displays. They need time to warm up to people. I accepted this explanation, though it didn't match the stories he'd told me about his warm, chaotic, emotionally expressive family. Maybe I'd misunderstood, I thought. Maybe he'd been exaggerating for effect, the way people sometimes do when they're trying to impress someone new. But the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Why had the dinner been at a restaurant rather than his family home? Why had everyone seemed so uncomfortable? Why had Rebecca been so withdrawn when Marcus had described her as outgoing and vivacious? I started paying closer attention to his stories about his family, listening for inconsistencies or gaps in the narrative. But Marcus was careful, consistent in his details, and I began to wonder if I was reading too much into what had probably just been an awkward first meeting. After all, I reasoned, meeting your boyfriend's family is inherently stressful for everyone involved. Maybe they'd been as nervous as I was. Maybe they'd been trying so hard to make a good impression that they'd come across as stiff and formal instead of warm and welcoming. I decided to be patient, to give them time to get to know me. I asked Marcus about planning another get-together. Maybe something more casual where we could all relax and be ourselves. Sure, he said, but he never followed through. Whenever I brought up his family, he'd find a reason to change the subject or postpone making plans. There was always something. Work deadlines, travel schedules, family obligations that somehow never included me. Then, 3 weeks later, he brought up Rebecca's engagement. We were having breakfast at my apartment, one of those lazy Sunday mornings that I'd come to treasure. Marcus was reading the newspaper while I made coffee, and the apartment was filled with the kind of comfortable domesticity that felt like a preview of our future together. Rebecca's got some news, he said, looking up from the sports section. She's engaged. Oh my God, that's wonderful, I said, genuinely excited. When did this happen? Who's the guy? His name is David. He's a good guy, works in finance. They've been seeing each other for about 6 months. 6 months and they're already engaged? That's fast. Yeah, well, when you know, Marcus said, but something in his tone suggested he didn't entirely approve of the speed. When's the wedding? Oh, they're not rushing into anything. Probably next year sometime. Maybe the year after. Rebecca wants to do it right, you know. Big wedding, all the family. I nodded, making a mental note to ask Rebecca about wedding planning the next time we saw her. I'd always enjoyed weddings. The pageantry and celebration, the way they brought families together. I imagined helping with the planning. Maybe even being asked to be a bridesmaid if Rebecca and I became close. We should take them out to celebrate, I suggested. Maybe a nice dinner somewhere. I'd love to get to know David. Sure, Marcus said, but he was already turning back to his newspaper. I'll set something up. But of course, he never did. Just like he never followed through on plans to have his parents over for dinner, or to visit them at their house, or to include me in any of the family activities he'd described so vividly when we first started dating. Marcus's family events seemed to dry up after that dinner at Romano's. When I'd ask about getting together with his parents or siblings, he'd always have a reason why it wasn't a good time. His parents were busy with work. Rebecca was stressed about her job. There was a family illness that required privacy. They're pretty private people, he'd say when I'd press for specifics. They don't really do big social gatherings. This didn't match the Marcus I'd fallen in love with, the one who'd regaled me with stories of chaotic family barbecues and impromptu gatherings that lasted until dawn. But I told myself that maybe I'd misunderstood. that maybe he'd been exaggerating for effect, the way people sometimes do when they're trying to impress someone new. Or maybe meeting me had changed something. Maybe his family had decided they didn't like me after all, and Marcus was trying to protect my feelings by keeping us separate. The thought made my stomach clench with anxiety, but I couldn't bring myself to ask him directly. I was too afraid of what the answer might be. Instead, I threw myself into our relationship, trying to prove that I was worthy of his love, even if his family remained unconvinced. I cooked his favorite meals, planned surprise weekend trips, listened to his work complaints with endless patience. I made myself indispensable, hoping that my devotion would eventually translate into acceptance from the people who mattered most to him. But the harder I tried, the more distant he seemed to become. He started working later hours, spending more time with friends I'd never met, taking business trips that seemed to multiply without explanation. When I'd ask about his day, he'd give me generic responses that revealed nothing about his actual experiences or emotions. I told myself it was just a phase, that all couples went through periods of distance and reconnection. I told myself that he was stressed about work, that he was dealing with family issues he didn't want to burden me with. I told myself that love was about patience and understanding, about giving someone space when they needed it. But deep down, I was beginning to understand that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. The easy intimacy we'd shared in the beginning had been replaced by a careful politeness that felt more like roommates than lovers. We were going through the motions of a relationship without any of the genuine connection that had drawn us together in the first place. The truth hit me like a physical blow on a Saturday evening in late November. I was curled up on our couch, scrolling through Instagram while Marcus was out with his college friends. He'd invited me to join them, but I declined, claiming I had a headache. Really, I just wanted some quiet time to catch up on the novel I'd been trying to finish for weeks. I'd been feeling emotionally drained lately, like I was constantly trying to solve a puzzle without having all the pieces. The apartment felt too quiet without him, filled with the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. I'd been living in this space for 3 years, but lately it felt less like home and more like a waiting room. A place where I was marking time until my real life began. I'd been scrolling mindlessly through my feed, the usual mix of vacation photos and political rants and advertisements for products I didn't need. But then Rebecca's Instagram story popped up, and I tapped on it without thinking. The image that filled my screen made my heart stop. It was Rebecca in a white wedding dress, standing in front of what was clearly a hotel ballroom. But this wasn't just any wedding dress. It was an elaborate gown with layers of silk and lace, the kind of dress that takes months to order and weeks to alter. The caption read, "Best day of my life at the Four Seasons. So grateful for everyone who made this perfect." My hands were shaking as I swiped through the rest of her story. There were dozens of photos and videos from what was obviously a lavish wedding reception. The Four Seasons ballroom was decorated with white orchids and candles, round tables covered in champagne-colored linens, a dance floor filled with people in formal attire. This wasn't the maybe next year wedding Marcus had described. This was a major production, the kind of event that gets planned for months in advance. The Four Seasons doesn't just have ballrooms available on short notice. Those kinds of venues get booked a year ahead of time. And there, in multiple shots, was Marcus. My Marcus. Wearing a black tuxedo that I'd never seen before, giving a speech at the reception. Dancing with Rebecca in her wedding dress, both of them laughing in a way that suggested deep affection and shared history. Laughing with relatives I recognized from our dinner at Romano's. Relatives who were now dressed in evening gowns and formal suits, looking nothing like the casual family I'd been introduced to. In one photo, he was standing with his parents, all 3 of them beaming with happiness. His father's arm was around his shoulders, His mother was wiping tears from her eyes, and Marcus looked more relaxed and joyful than I'd seen him in months. These weren't the reserved, private people Marcus had described. These were people who knew how to celebrate, who understood the importance of marking life's big moments with style and joy. These were people who were capable of warmth and emotional expression when they wanted to be. But the image that made my blood run cold was a group photo labeled Wedding Party. Rebecca stood in the center in her elaborate gown, surrounded by bridesmaids in burgundy dresses and groomsmen in black tuxedos. And there, standing next to Marcus, was the familiar face, Jessica, his ex-girlfriend, the one he'd dated for 3 years before we met, the one he'd claimed was completely out of his life, and not someone I ever think about anymore. She was wearing a burgundy bridesmaid dress that fit her perfectly, her blonde hair styled in an elegant updo, her smile radiant as she looked at the camera. She looked like she belonged there, like she was part of the family in a way that I had never been allowed to be. I set my phone down with trembling hands, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just a wedding Marcus had attended. It was a major family event, the kind of celebration that gets planned for months in advance. The kind of event where the bride chooses her wedding party carefully, where every detail is orchestrated to perfection. Jessica wasn't just a guest at this wedding. She was a bridesmaid, which meant she'd been involved in the planning process for months. She'd been to dress fittings and bridal showers and bachelorette parties. She'd been part of the family celebrations while I'd been completely excluded from them. I thought back to our conversation about Rebecca's engagement, how Marcus had been so vague about timing. Probably next year sometime, he'd said. Maybe the year after. Rebecca wants to do it right, you know. Big wedding, all the family. But clearly the wedding had been planned for months. You don't book the Four Seasons ballroom, order custom florals, and coordinate a 12-person wedding party without extensive advance planning. Every detail I could see in the photos suggested months of preparation and significant financial investment, which meant Marcus had been lying to me, not just omitting details or being private, actively lying. He'd known exactly when his sister's wedding was happening, and he'd made a deliberate choice to exclude me from it. I scrolled through more of Rebecca's photos, my heart sinking with each image. There was his whole family, dressed to the nines, celebrating what was clearly one of the most important days of their lives. His parents looked radiant. His Uncle Tom was giving an animated toast. His Aunt Susan was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. In one video, Marcus was giving a speech, and I could see the love and pride in his expression as he talked about his sister. He spoke about childhood memories and family traditions, about how Rebecca had always been the light of their family, how proud he was to see her so happy. The Marcus in that video was nothing like the distant, guarded man I'd been living with for the past few months. This Marcus was warm and funny and emotionally present, the kind of person who drew people to him without effort. This was the Marcus I'd fallen in love with, the one who'd seemed to disappear sometime after that awkward dinner at Romano's. I found myself moving through the apartment like a sleepwalker, picking up framed photos of Marcus and me, studying them as if they might reveal some hidden truth. Had I been imagining our relationship? Was I just a placeholder, someone to fill time between more important commitments? But no, I knew what we'd shared was real. The quiet Sunday mornings when we'd read the newspaper together, taking turns reading interesting articles aloud. The way he'd hold my hand during movies, absent-mindedly tracing patterns on my palm with his thumb. The night last spring when I'd had food poisoning and he'd stayed up with me, bringing me water and crackers and smoothing my hair back from my forehead. You don't fake that kind of tenderness. You don't manufacture that level of intimacy. The connection between us had been genuine. I was certain of that. Which made his deception even more painful. This wasn't about not loving me. It was about being ashamed of me, about deciding that I wasn't good enough to be part of his real life, the one that included 4-course dinners at the Four Seasons and family traditions that went back generations. I was still sitting on the couch, staring at my phone, when Marcus came home around midnight. He was slightly drunk, his cheeks flushed from the cold, and his shirt wrinkled, looking loose and happy in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. There was an energy about him that suggested he'd had a genuinely good time, that he'd been somewhere he could be completely himself. "Hey, beautiful," he said, leaning down to kiss me. His breath smelled like whiskey, and something else, expensive cologne that I didn't recognize. "How was your evening?" I looked up at him. This man I'd been sharing a bed with for 2 years. This man whose coffee preferences I knew by heart, and whose mother's maiden name I'd memorized for security questions. This man who had looked me in the eye and told me his sister was probably getting married, next year sometime. "Fine," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "How was yours?" "Good. Just grabbed some drinks with the guys." He collapsed onto the couch next to me, pulling me against his side in a gesture that had always felt natural, but now seemed somehow performative. "Mike's got this new girlfriend he's completely obsessed with. Couldn't stop talking about her all night." He launched into a story about his friend's new relationship, describing the woman's career and personality with the kind of detail that suggested he'd been paying close attention. As he talked, I found myself studying his face, looking for signs of the lies I now knew he was capable of telling. "I told him to be careful," Marcus continued, "that the honeymoon phase doesn't last forever. You have to be realistic about what you're getting into." The irony of his words hit me like a slap. Here he was, warning his friend about the dangers of a new love, while actively sabotaging his own relationship with lies and exclusion. "Marcus," I said carefully, interrupting his story, "I saw Rebecca's Instagram story tonight." His body went rigid against mine. I felt the change immediately. The way his muscles tensed, the way his breathing shifted, the way his hand on my shoulder seemed to freeze in place. For a moment we sat in complete silence, the weight of unspoken truth settling between us like a physical presence. "Sarah, I can explain." "Can you?" I stood up, needing space to breathe, needing to see his face clearly. "Because I'm having trouble understanding how you explain, forgetting to mention that your sister's wedding was tonight. At the Four Seasons. In black tie." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd always found endearing but now seemed calculating. "It's complicated." "Complicated how?" "My family." He paused, searching for words, and I could see him calculating what version of the truth he could get away with. "They have certain expectations about the kinds of people we bring around." The casual cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. "The kinds of people? You mean people like me?" "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean, Marcus? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you've been keeping me separate from your real life for 2 years. Like I'm some kind of secret you're ashamed of." "You're not a secret," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was looking at his hands rather than at me, and I could see the guilt written in every line of his posture. "Then why wasn't I invited to your sister's wedding? Why did you lie about when it was happening? Why did you tell me Rebecca was probably getting married next year when you knew it was happening tonight?" The questions hung in the air between us, each one a small accusation that he couldn't deny. I watched him struggle to find answers that wouldn't make him look like the villain in this story, but we both knew there weren't any. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I knew you'd want to come." The honesty of it was somehow worse than the lies. At least lies suggested he thought I was worth protecting. This was just naked selfishness. The admission that he'd been prioritizing his own comfort over my feelings for months. And Jessica was there. I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Your ex-girlfriend. The one who's supposedly completely out of your life. She's Rebecca's friend. She was a bridesmaid, Marcus. Which means she's been involved in wedding planning for months. Which means she's been part of your family's life, while I've been completely excluded from it. It's not like that. Then what is it like? Because I'm trying to understand how the man I've been living with for 2 years could look me in the eye and lie about something this important. He stood up, pacing to the window and back, his movements agitated and defensive. You want to know the truth? Fine. My parents didn't think you were right for me. They thought you were too different, too ambitious, too independent. They wanted me to work things out with Jessica. Each word felt like a small knife, precise and cutting. I had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was still devastating. And you agreed with them. I don't know what I think anymore, he said. And for the first time that night he sounded genuinely vulnerable. I love you, Sarah. I do. But my family, they're important to me. And they've never accepted you. Have you ever stood up for me? Ever told them they were wrong? His silence was answer enough. I felt something shifting inside me, a hardening that started in my chest and spread outward. This man, who I'd been planning a future with, who I'd been considering moving across the country for, if he got the job transfer he was hoping for, had been auditioning me for a role in his life while keeping me separated from everything that actually mattered to him.